Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special session of Growing Up in Science. My name is Wei Jima. I'm a professor of neuroscience and psychology at New York University. And Growing Up in Science is a series in which we explore the human side behind the science. So the stories that behind the CV, we often get speakers to talk about their life and career story with a special focus on the things that went wrong, doubts, detours, struggles. And once a year, we have this special event where we get the stories from behind graduate school. And this hopefully will be a useful source of information for those of you who are thinking of applying to graduate school, and maybe even if you're already there and want to get other perspectives on mentorship and work-life balance, lab culture, etc. This event is also part of the virtual summer research internship organized by NYU Psychology program, in which we work on skill development, hidden curriculum, mentoring, as well as actual research for students who are interested in applying to PhD programs, the PhD program here. Today's session will be moderated and has been organized by Sophie Arnold. She's a PhD student in the psychology department at NYU, and I'll let Sophie take it from here and introduce the panelists.
Okay, thank you, Weiji, for the introduction. So yes, my name is Sophie, and today we're going to be running a panel on what I wish I had known about doing a PhD, and we're going to be hearing from 4 current PhD student panelists. So Ajua Duker is a 5th-year PhD candidate in social psychology at Yale University under the mentorship of Dr. Jennifer Richardson. Her research expertise focuses on how the psychology of emotions and emotion regulation can be used to improve the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral health outcomes of members of marginalized communities, with a particular focus on understanding and testing the efficacy of these strategies in the context of contending with discrimination. She attended Yale University for her undergraduate degree and was a research specialist at Princeton University for 2 years before entering her PhD program. She serves on the Yale Psychology Diversity Committee, has served on the Yale Psychology Committee for Racial Equity and Justice, and has mentored over 10 undergraduate students, both at Yale and other institutions, through mentorship programming. Carlos Gomes is a 4th-year PhD student in the biomedical engineering program at Boston University. He works with Dr. Darren Robler at the Biomedical Optics Technology Lab in the development of non-invasive optical-based technologies in order to measure the sternocleidomastoid of patients in the ICU. He graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Medical Engineering from Boston University with a concentration in nanotechnologies. Between his undergraduate studies and PhD work, Carlos worked as a research technician in the optics and Martino's lab at Massachusetts General Hospital in order to investigate Alzheimer's disease. Hannah Hawk is a 5th-year PhD student at the University of Chicago in developmental psychology. With her advisor, Dr. Alex Shah, Hannah studies moral and social cognitive development with a focus on children's understanding of impartial procedures for group coordination. She attended Kalamazoo College for undergrad and a small liberal arts school in Michigan, and went straight through from undergrad to graduate school. She worked as a research assistant in Dr. Alex Shah's lab the summer before she applied to graduate school, which was a huge factor in her decision-making. She was also very interested and involved in Chicago's graduate worker unionization efforts during her early years as a graduate student. Michelle Kim is a 3rd-year neuroscience PhD student at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where she is currently in the lab of Dr. Hala Harani Nicholas. Her research uses rodent models to study how isolation during development affects social behavior and neural circuits of reward in adulthood. Michelle went to Grinnell College, where she majored in psychology with a concentration in neuroscience. And after graduating from Grinnell, Michelle worked as a research technician and a lab manager at UNC Chapel Hill. She also spent a year serving full-time in the National Surface Program AmeriCorps, where she worked with students in Chapel Hill public schools. Michelle continues to be passionate about supporting science education. She currently serves as a volunteer through BioBus, a community organization dedicated to making science more accessible to students around New York City, and as a member of Mount Sinai's Women in Science organization, and volunteers with Girls Empowered in Medicine and Science to help middle school girls explore STEM. So thank you to all 4 of our graduate student panelists today. And thank you all for the excellent suggestions for discussion questions. We got a lot of questions, which was super helpful in figuring out how to best tailor this panel for the benefit of all of its attendees. However, there were so many questions that we won't be able to get quite to all of them. And so instead, we're going to focus on 6 broad themes. And hopefully at the end, there will be time for any additional questions that folks might have. And as a reminder, while PhD students share many common experiences, every individual's journey is unique. And so gaining insights from a number of different people and a number of different graduate students at different schools and different programs can help paint a more complete picture of what it is to be a PhD student. And without further ado, we're going to move into some of the questions for the panelists. So the first broad question is, how did you realize you wanted to do a PhD? And so first we're going to start with Ajua. So Ajua, how did you realize you wanted to do a PhD?
Thank you so much, Sophie. So I think how I decided that I wanted to do a PhD was through research experience and classes that I took during undergrad. So I would say when I started my undergrad degree, I actually thought that I wanted to major in political science and potentially become like a diplomat. That's where I thought my career was going. So I took a lot of political science classes, and I also was gearing up to be a French major because I took a lot of French in high school. So I pretty much thought that that was going to be my double major, and therefore I would use those skills to do like foreign affairs. But basically, after taking a few semesters of political science and international relations courses, and essentially taking psychology courses for fun, I kind of realized that my interests kind of were not in those classes. I didn't really enjoy the format of the debates. I was more so interested in like understanding underlying cognitive and emotional processes that essentially like underlie decision making. So I thought I wanted to do decision making. That was sort of my first interest. And so I took a class with someone who happened to be the director of undergraduate studies. And I set up a meeting with her, and I was basically just like, I really like the psych material, and I've been taking these classes as my fun electives. But I'm thinking I actually might want to switch my major, but I don't really have a sense of like career-wise what I would do with that, because I hadn't really heard of, where a psychology degree could take you career-wise. And so she basically she was awesome. She laid out all of these different options that I could use and take that would lead me on a path towards either a PhD or getting a master's in social work or switching to clinical psychology. So she kind of talked about the sort of subfields of psychology in that conversation. And she was kind of like, these are some paths you could take as a first step for you to get a sense of what it would be like to engage more deeply with material. You should think about being a research assistant in a lab. So I did that. And that was sort of where I got a better sense of, do I like the day-to-day of research? Do I want to like spend more time learning how to ask better questions and formulate better studies? And so that sort of like set me on that trajectory, and I just kind of prioritized continuing to do research and doing summer programs.
That's great. Thank you, Ajua. And Carlos, how about you?
Yeah, I also kind of had some similar trajectory, but a little bit different. So when I graduated out of high school, I really wanted to do like cancer bio research, like help cure cancer and all that. And I just knew, talking to my family who are really STEM people, that you kind of need a PhD to do that kind of research at like a high end level, was where I saw myself. But through my schooling at undergrad, I kind of realized chemistry and biology are not my favorite things to do. I prefer to work more hands-on, more technology stuff, which is fine within my field because biomedical engineering is so varied that I still could do like development of technologies. And it was until my last year where I was actually forced to do research part of the curriculum that I joined a neuroscience laboratory that like specialized in developing new optical technologies. I was like, wow, this is really fun. I get to work with my hands, build things, and the answers they're looking are really unique and like basically the boundary of what humanity knows in science. So it's like, okay, I kind of want to do this, but do I want to commit to 5 years of this at least? So it's like, okay, maybe not 5 years. I could do a master's, but that is more financial money I have to invest before I can even decide, okay, yes. But I also learned of the whole research techniques and persistence that you can do research as a introductory level, where this is basically helping and shadowing other people like postdocs and sometimes grad students in their own research at a laboratory. So I applied for some of those jobs and I got into one of them, and there I really just pretty much lived the life of a researcher for 2 full years. And at that point I was like, okay, I've done this for 2 years and I don't hate it. I actually want to keep going and continue this. So I was like, okay, it's time to apply for a PhD, and I did.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. Yeah, the transition between undergrad and a position before going to graduate school sounds very informative. Hannah, could you speak to how you realized you wanted to do a PhD?
Yeah, I think similar to what has already been said, a lot of it was kind of like getting some of that class experience and that research experience that made me really, in terms of considering what I wanted to do in the future and the sort of things that I wanted to do for my day-to-day, I think the research experience in particular was really informative to me in terms of, would I be happy kind of living and answering these sort of questions for the next 5 years? And I actually studied something pretty unrelated to psychology as an undergrad. So I started off with philosophy and did one kind of research assistantship over a summer during my junior year. And it was just like so fun and so exciting. And I thought it was really interesting. And I think after that, it was really the thing that kind of got me thinking about applying to PhD programs. And I think the thing that's really nice about PhD programs in particular is that many of them do tend to be funded. So if you're kind of thinking about a long-term option in which you're doing a lot of research, it is a good option for that reason as well.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. And then Michelle, can you also speak to this question?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for the introduction earlier. So I majored in psychology in undergrad, and when I first chose that major, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with it, but I took a biology course, and in that biology course, we did a lot of hands-on laboratory experience that was like neuroscience adjacent, and that was really my first exposure to working in a lab environment and probing specific neuroscience related questions. And I knew from that point forward that I definitely wanted to do more of this. I wasn't really sure what that would entail, but I knew that I wanted to keep doing hands-on research experience. And the more people that I talked to, asking them about how I could do more of this particular thing, a lot of them kept telling me, oh, you know, like if you want to keep doing this particular thing and you want to grow in your career as a scientist, you're probably going to have to go get a PhD. And I didn't really know what that entailed either at the time. And so after undergrad, I decided to work in a lab for a couple of years before deciding to apply to graduate school. And during that time, I think, how did I know I was ready? Honestly, I didn't feel ready a lot of the time when I was in that in-between period between undergrad and graduate school. And I think I was ready before I knew I was ready. I heard from a lot of people around me that I was ready to apply to graduate school, but I had a lot of hesitancy about making that decision because I knew that it was a big commitment. I saw a lot of graduate students through my research technician position, and I saw how much work they had to do and how stressed they were. But I think the big deciding factor for me personally was that when I was doing research at UNC Chapel Hill as a technician, my research was always tied to somebody else's research, or somebody else would always drive the research questions forward. And I really wanted to have a chance to be able to do my own independent research and to be able to ask the questions that I was interested in and really spearhead that whole process. Because I think one thing that originally really got me into research to begin with was just the fact that, you know, like I could come up with these questions and like I could decide how to answer them. And, you know, if it didn't work out, and I would be the one who would make changes and like reshift the focus to take on a different approach. So I think wanting that independence and wanting that growth as a scientist was what ultimately led me to finally apply to grad school.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all for sharing. And I think now this kind of nicely transitions into our next broad question, which is about what the application and interview process for graduate school was like. In particular, how did you ultimately decide where to apply? Like how many schools, what kinds of programs, as well as interview tips, and how you ultimately made the decision of what lab you worked in. So Carlos, if you can take a first stab at this question, that would be great.
Yeah, so basically, to begin with how I applied, I was thinking about, first of all, where I want to live in, because I was in a relationship with someone. So we had to really think about, like, okay, if we're going to move somewhere, if that means cross country, like where can the both of us have a successful career, etc. So that was on my mind. For like the general areas, obviously there was flexibility, there was a lot of communication between the two of us. And I just picked major cities basically because this has happened to very, very co-align with the good programs I wanted to apply to, and also like good marketplaces. And I applied to 10 schools once I knew the area. So I want to go, I pretty much looked into which universities had the professors that I would be interested in working with, and specifically that kind of research. Because when I was applying, I was like, okay, I have a general idea what I want to learn and like skills and get the experience, but like the specific research I wanted to do, I was open to it. So I look into a lot of different professors' research, and that's when I started to get a list of institutions that had at least 3 professors in them that I would be happy to work with. So I was like, okay, if I have 3 professors I'd be happy to work with, I'm definitely applying for this school. And when the time came for me to actually do my interviews, I pretty much just asked just some help from some like of the people in the lab, like what to expect for questions, all that stuff. And they said it kind of varies depending on what the school is looking for, because some programs you sketch up that you're just in, and at that point they'll actually try and do the opposite, try and sell you on the school. So those were really straightforward and simple. But other ones, like, you're pretty much being interviewed to be fit into a specific lab. So like I had to do a lot of research on the professor, on like the most recent papers, and like the most current projects that I could see myself working in, because they'd be like, oh, what kind of research do you see yourself doing in this laboratory? So I had to be ready and give them like ideas and show them how my goals and my expertise would align with them. So I had to do a lot of background research on the lab and the professor himself. And how did I ultimately pick between to be here at Boston University? Actually, it was kind of hard for me, mainly because of the fact that at the end of the day, I was between here and Columbia University. So that was a hard choice because mostly the fact that deep down, it came to the fact that Columbia University, the name just carries weight to it compared to Boston, even though Boston University's they have really good school, the programs are about the same when the rankings get propped up. But the professors would be working, again, were really prestigious. So I basically just went to where would I be the happiest outside of school, because of the fact that a PhD is very demanding. I knew it was going to be very demanding. I was like, where am I going to be happier when I'm not in the lab? Where will I feel comfortable? And because Boston's pretty much been my home city for most of my life, I was like, I'm just going to stay in Boston.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlos. And then Hannah, what about you? What was the application and interview process like as you were applying?
Yeah. So I applied to 3 schools. I was pretty particular, I think, about the location for sure, as well as the professor fit. So I think one of the most important things that I've come to learn about graduate school and choosing graduate schools as I've kind of met, students who are applying to go to UChicago and hearing about their experience and this sort of thing, is that I think similar to what Carlos says, the location and considering if you're going to be happy for those 5 to 6 to 7 years that you're going to be at that location, it is really important. And it does affect like the work that you do, how happy you are, the relationships you make. And I think sometimes it can be tempting to kind of underestimate that effect of how it's going to be affecting your actual academic work. But for me, I think choosing to be in Chicago ended up being a really valuable thing for me. And I made some great connections that I feel like did an awesome job of supporting me in times that were really hard for my time in graduate school. The other thing, of course, I think Carlos also mentioned this, is it is really important to make sure that the professor that you're choosing to kind of work with is kind of nice and supportive towards graduate students. And also that it's, sometimes it does happen that you want to apply to work with one particular professor, but that professor can leave for some unforeseen reasons, whether it's moving schools or something like this. So similar to what Carlos says, I think it was really important for me to think about whether or not there were other people at that institution that I could work with if my primary advisor was gonna not be there anymore. So I think a lot of those sort of factors eventually went into where I picked my school. The other thing that I think is often good to mention is that in terms of funding, some schools do have funding that is linked to specific advisors, and some schools have funding that's linked to just the entire program in general. I eventually ended up picking a program in which my funding wasn't linked to my advisor. So, if anything went haywire, he wasn't necessarily signing my paycheck, which I think is an important or like a useful thing to have in a mentor-mentee relationship. But, those were just things that were very important for me. But I think in general, there's a lot of different factors that you can really think about and weigh in on.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Hannah. And then Michelle, what was the application and interview process like for you?
Yeah, so I applied to 9 programs, and I decided on those programs largely due to my research interests and seeing what professors were at these universities that fit my research interests. So at the time when I was applying to graduate school, my main research interests were about the neurobiology of substance use. So I was really big on finding professors who also were interested in exploring those ideas. I also applied to programs that were rotation-based. So like I think Carlos mentioned earlier, for some programs, you will apply to work specifically in someone's lab, but I was more interested in applying to the kind of program where during your first year, you can rotate in several labs and try out different lab environments and see which one works best for you. So with that in mind, I made sure to pick programs where I would find multiple people that I was interested in working with, because I heard from a lot of people that, if you like pigeonhole yourself too much into working with like one particular person, it could happen that that person might not have funding to take on a new student. That person just might not want to take on a new student in general. A lot can happen between like the time you apply and that's the time that you enter graduate school. So just keeping in mind that like that situation is always in flux, and making sure that there are multiple people that you could see yourself working with whose research interests align with yours. I did not limit myself geographically whatsoever. I like applied like all over the place. And if anything, like looking back, that's one minor regret that I have, because after I had finished applying and after I'd gotten all my decisions, one thing that I realized that like I really wish I could have done was move to be closer to my family. And the way that I had made those decisions had made it such that that wasn't really possible. So I would definitely consider location and environment as a huge factor when deciding what programs to apply to. And then also just like as a part of environment, the cost of living in that particular location. As it was mentioned earlier in terms of like funding from Hannah, there were some funding packages that I received, and I looked at just the cost of living in that particular area, and I realized it would be, while that program was really great, it would be really difficult to financially pull that off. So there are certain programs that I had to eliminate just because of the cost of living in that particular environment. So that is definitely a very real factor. In terms of preparing for interviews, I definitely made sure to read up on the research that was happening in the lab that I was interested in. I wouldn't say that you have to go like super in depth and know like every single thing about every single paper, but just have a general idea of how their research interests, again, align with yours and like what you would bring to the table in terms of that situation. And then my big advice would really be, of course, a big part of your interviews is talking with faculty, but another big part of your interviews is talking with current graduate students. And those people are honestly going to be some of the most valuable resources when it comes to helping you figure out if you would be a good fit at that particular institution. I think we have this idea that a graduate school interview is them interviewing you, but honestly, it's you interviewing that particular school as well. So taking the time to talk to the current students, see how they feel about their institution. Are they happy in general? Do they feel supported? And then also, you know, these people are probably going to be your colleagues and your peers in the future. So, you know, making sure that you stay professional all the time. A lot of them are probably going to tell you like, oh, don't worry, like I won't report back to faculty about like what you say here, or like I'm not here to evaluate you. But I think a good rule of thumb is generally just to assume that like people are always evaluating and like monitoring your behavior during the interview process. So keep that in mind. And then, I mean, I think I'll get to this later, but like ultimately picking who I wanted to work with was based largely on like making sure that I found a mentor who was a good fit for me personally in terms of mentorship style. So I decided to like compromise a little bit on the research question that I was interested in to make sure that I found a mentor who would be supportive and had a healthy lab environment and somewhere where I could see myself being mentally and emotionally well as like succeeding in my research.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And then Ajua, you mentioned earlier that you had a couple of different like tracks of psychology laid out for you. So what was the application to PhD programs like for you, an interview process, and how did you decide where to apply?
Thanks, Sophie. I will just say I sort of took a winding path towards figuring out what my research interests were. So I actually, my first sort of research assistant position was it was social and moral psychology. Then I worked in some clinical labs. Then I worked with a social psychologist who did research with a public health focus. And then I actually, my full-time RA job, I was working with cognitive and decision-making psychologists. And ultimately, I decided to do social psychology with a focus on diversity, inequality, and discrimination. So I sort of had a pretty wide sampling of different research questions, different projects, and different methodologies, which I think was useful. I wouldn't necessarily say you need to do all of that to figure out what you want to do. I just was looking for that fit. And I think that sort of came just with exposure. Like, I think my sort of full-time RA gig was extremely instrumental in like shifting my approach when it came to engaging with the sort of departmental academic community, because as an undergrad, you're almost like a customer, like receiving instruction, and you're choosing the instruction you receive so that you can complete your requirements and get your degree. But as a research assistant and as a graduate student, you're more collegial in terms of the fact that you are open to collaborating with a bunch of different people, and you should be sort of seeing the folks that you interact with as colleagues. And also in like a healthy departmental environment, you would have that sort of flexibility to get on research projects and sort of explore different interests that you have with professors and grad students that you'd work with. And that's definitely what I did. And I think that was also extremely helpful in figuring out my interest. I think a lot of really important themes have been like already mentioned that I feel like are extremely, that I see a lot of similarities. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but I will say a couple things with respect to preparing for interviews. I think it's extremely instrumental to do mock interviews if you have the chance to. That was really, really helpful to just get over some of the nerves that you might be experiencing when you're just interacting with these people who are extremely high status. And you want to impress them, obviously, because you're interested in working with them, right? So I think getting into that, getting comfortable with that setting by sort of going through trial sessions is helpful for you to not feel as much like stage fright when you're sort of answering questions, and it's also allowing for like more preparation, right? For that interview. And I think a lot of what's been said in terms of like, how did I ultimately pick who I wanted to work with? So I'll just quickly say that I only applied to like four or five schools, I think five. So I was pretty narrow because I sort of knew what my research interests were. And I also had a pretty clear sense of where I wanted to be geographically. And so I actually, the person that is my primary advisor, she was at a different school. And I actually got information that she was switching universities. So I actually then switched where my application was going to be, because I was very hyper-focused on working with specific people. But as others said, I think Michelle had mentioned this, that you want to be in an environment where you could see yourself working with or engaging with several professors. I think that's extremely important. Just because these folks will end up on your committees, right, for your departmental requirements all the way up into your dissertation. So in addition to wanting folks who you feel that their interests are somewhat aligned to some degree with yours, you also want to receive useful feedback for your projects, right? So like, you don't want to necessarily, it's great to get different perspectives, especially because my research interests are sort of like at the intersection of different disciplines. Like I do a lot of work that's relevant to clinical psychologists because it's emotion regulation focused. Then specifically like emotion researchers, I can get a lot of insights from them. And then also folks who have a focus on inequality and discrimination, their opinions are useful to me. So it was important to me to sort of exist in a department where I could get useful feedback from those folks.
Thank you, Ajua. That was all super helpful. And yes, there seems to be a couple of broad themes that have brought up about applying to places where you yourself could see yourself living there for 5 years, and that the people that you're applying to there's more than one person that you think that you would enjoy working with. So thank you all for those great insights. And now we're going to move on to our third question. So what does a typical day look like in the PhD life look like for you? Or maybe a better question is, what does a typical week in a PhD life look like for you? And to start us off, Hannah, can you take a stab at this question?
Yeah, of course. So I think it definitely depends on your advisor's style. So a lot of these questions will, I think, depend on your advisor's style as well as the department style. But typically what I do in a week is I have weekly or bi-weekly meetings with my advisor. So it depends on the needs of our projects at any given moment. But we always typically will meet at least once a week to kind of talk about the logistics of projects, as well as kind of broader general ideas of things that we're interested in conducting. The day-to-day of mine has also changed a lot throughout the course of grad school. So for example, during early grad school, what I was doing a lot of is I was in a lot of classes. I was trying to explore the department, kind of get more of a general idea of what sort of research I really could do. But then as I've gotten older and I've been finished with my classes and finished with my TA-ships, a lot of the research that I've been doing has become much more kind of narrow in terms of fitting a specific research program that I'm trying to develop as a researcher. And so I kind of have a sense of the collaborators that I'm meeting with the projects that I'm trying to get moving across different stages. So I had, I guess also another thing is that early in on my grad school experience, it was a lot of kind of like brainstorming, actual data collection, and these sort of activities. And then later on, of course, it's a lot of writing. So I've done so much writing, I think, in my past few years that really feels like it's taken up kind of the bulk of my time in comparison to what I was doing early in grad school. And it's been a lot more synthesis within late grad school than during early grad school. Let's see. So I'm sure these will also come up when other people talk, but I think the primary skill that I learned during grad school, one of the hard skills that I learned during grad school that I did not have as an undergrad, was R in particular. So this is a data analysis tool that I really had no, I used SPSS as an undergrad and kind of had no idea what it was, but there's a lot of classes, in particular, if you enter like a psychology PhD or something like this, that will kind of get you teaching or get you these hard skills, and they've been really useful for me. So even if the classes are kind of outside of your requirements, I've taken a lot of them and I thought they were both useful, interesting, and fun. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. And then Michelle, what does a typical day look like for you as a neuroscientist?
For me, this really depends on what I have going on any particular, I guess, like phase in my research. So if I'm in the middle of collecting data, usually my day is such that I go in the morning. I try to structure my day so I do like less active brain worky stuff in the morning. So, like writing emails, writing in general, like data analysis, catching up on reading in the mornings. And then usually I devote my afternoons / early evenings to running experiments, because I feel like for me and just like my circadian rhythm, that works better in general. In terms of how often I meet with my advisor, yeah, I also meet with my advisor once a week or every other week. We check in and just see how I'm doing in terms of my project. And then we came up together with my project. And I think because the project is constantly changing and evolving depending on what I have going on and what data I collect, a lot of it is really just like being flexible, seeing what new directions we can take whenever we meet with each other. And then, putting that out there, and then just continuing to like stay open and keep an open mind in terms of the data that comes in and like the progress that we make. And then, when I'm not busy collecting data, usually it's because I am writing for a manuscript or for a grant proposal or for an exam of some kind. So during those phases, most of my day is spent writing and reading. So I'll just go into lab, spend most of the day just looking at papers, writing, and sometimes some weeks that's all I do.
Thank you. And then really quick, Michelle, so for what kind of materials do you guys use in your research program as you're collecting data and analyzing data? Did you know how to use all of these tools before you started your PhD, or was it easy to pick them up during your PhD?
Similar to what Hannah said, I was also not familiar with, I had learned some R before I came into grad school, but I definitely have had to become more familiar with it during my PhD. And then there are other data analysis programs that are much more, I would say, like user-friendly, like GraphPad Prism, that I was already familiar with going into graduate school because of my research technician work. And then I think in general, like in terms of the like skills or like the tools that I would say I picked up during graduate school, as silly or as minor as it sounds, like using a citation manager and just becoming really good at like organizing articles was a big skill I had to pick up. I would definitely recommend for anyone out there who is planning on starting graduate school, or or is someone who is like interested in organizing what they're reading, start using a citation manager like now and becoming familiar with how it works, because I think it's a great resource for organizing all these different papers that I'm sure you guys are reading and want to keep in one place. And then when you're writing, it's also super helpful so that you don't have to go in and put in all those citations manually.
For sure. Do you have a citation manager that you like to use?
I have been using Zotero this whole time, but I've also heard that EndNote is great, or I think the other one is like Mendeley that I think people recommend. But I personally use Zotero.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. And then Ajua, what about you? What does a typical day in the PhD life look like for you?
Yeah, so I just want to say disclaimer that my days, right, I feel like the typical day looks different depending on where you are in your PhD program. So right now I'm a 5th year, incoming 6th year. So I have a lot more time to focus solely on research. Earlier in my program, I had course requirements and I had TFing requirements, TA requirements, where I had to be in classes at a certain time and like do the duties that are sort of associated with coursework and TFing, so grading, assignment creation, meetings to like coordinate stuff with the class. Now I'm kind of just, I have my like mandatory lab meetings, and I have my sort of weekly meeting with my advisor. And then I kind of have to structure my day around pushing forward different projects, either related to manuscripts or my dissertation. So I think I just wanted to sort of flag something that Michelle had said that I think is useful, is that she had mentioned that she found that she was most productive in the afternoon. And I find that I'm most productive in the morning. And I think the point of me bringing that up is just to say that like you should figure out during your PhD when your brain is most efficient, and sort of structure your day around that, right? Obviously, there will be constraints depending on where you are in the program. But right, because I know that I'm most productive in the morning, I try to do some of my harder thinky tasks in the morning, right? So like whether that be responding to reviewers on a manuscript or writing or reading, I try to do those things in the morning, because then when I'm a little bit tired, I can do something that is a little bit less, doesn't take as much of my brain to do, right? So for me, that looks like analyzing data, just because once you learn how to analyze data, you kind of just apply that skill to whatever project that you're doing. So I just wanted to say that. I also wanted to just say also that, like Michelle, I use Zotero. I use Zotero as a citation manager specifically because I find that sometimes I find it very efficient to work with folks like collaborators via Google Docs. And Zotero has a Google Doc plugin, which is great when you're working with manuscripts. So that's my bias coming in, but just thinking about how your processes might be, what manager you would choose that would sort of work in tandem the best with your specific processes is just something to consider. I'm trying to think. Okay, just to quickly touch on some questions about the question about funding and conference presentations. I think towards the beginning of my program, I applied to write like fellowships, so like the NSF and the Ford, because they usually have the pre-doctoral fellowships that you're eligible for, I think up until your second year of grad school. So I applied to those and similar types of fellowships early on. And then randomly, if I found opportunities, I would just apply sometimes between then and now later in my PhD. There's sort of like dissertation related fellowships that I'm applying for now, as well as some postdoc related fellowships. So I think there just tends to be a lot of opportunities sort of early in your PhD, then more of a lull towards the middle, maybe, I mean, just more idiosyncratic funding opportunities, and then more as you sort of get closer to finishing your dissertation. I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, Ajua. Yeah, there's the conference funding, or the funding that you can apply to through your particular university, versus the funding that is applicable through big national grants like the NSF or the NIH is also good to be thinking about. So thank you so much. And then Carlos, could you also talk about what a typical day or week looks like for you as a PhD student?
Yeah, definitely. Just want to preface it, as everyone kind of mentioned, it does change over time. As the fourth year, I'm now in really the thick of my thesis research. So right now, most of my things are me doing like the real hands-on projects, because I'm an engineer. I have to build things and like actually do a lot of validations of the instruments I built. So it's a lot of in the lab taking data stuff. But I do have a general group meeting that my professor has with me and other people in like the same sphere of stuff, and also a joint group meeting with another PI where it's really good for like good practices, like when people have like any conference or thesis presentations they need to practice, they just go there and it's like a real audience and feedback. But the one thing I do want to mention is it really does depend on your PI style, because my PI is a little bit hands off. So like early on, I had to really email him and be like, I'm still trying to figure out things, can we meet more regularly? And he'd be glad to do that. And it was just me trying to be like, okay, this is my plan for the semester. These are like the goals, or at least logical / realistic / on track with your expectations. And that has actually really changed over time to now. He actually has to email me to figure out what I'm doing and then to check on it and be like, okay, great, you're on track. And me telling him what kind of projects and ideas I'm pushing forward, and him to be like, great, keep going forward, good job. For skills that I do, because I'm the most technical person in the lab, I have developed skills on machining, software, CADing, so like creating computer-aided designs to 3D print. And all of them have come through either classes or even my own hobby things of like, I just like to code things for fun, and that's just really helped just be applied for my own stuff. And some of them I learned through undergrad, / some of them I took classes here to get experience as a grad student. For funding wise, just to expand on the grant wise, there's some grants you can actually apply even before you're in a program, like the NSF one. You can actually apply as an undergrad, even if you took some time off and did research technician job. You can still apply as a undergraduate student, which is what I did, and I actually got it, and that opened up a lot of doors for exploration, and actually had allowed me to be selected for internal grants by the department, because sometimes when you get a funding scholarship from a university, there'll be specific grants only the university knows that's like given to you for being one of the top students they want to show off. So those, I would say, just try to apply for as soon as possible, because a lot of these grants also have funding for like going off to conferences and doing other things like internships, and opens up a lot of doors for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Carlos. And thank you for talking about how like the day in the life of a PhD student has changed from your first year through now. And I think that will nicely transition us to the next question, which is related to like the work-life, which is related to what a week really looks like for you guys. But how do you balance like work and life? And in particular, how do you balance like the relationship with your advisor and your work outside of graduate school? And so first we can have Michelle answer this question. That would be great.
For sure. I think now that I'm in a place in my PhD where I'm done with my coursework and I'm mainly focusing on my research right now, I am trying really hard to approach my research more like a 9-to-5 job, if possible. Although this definitely depends on the current situation. Like, for example, I'm working on a grant proposal right now, and that is definitely not a 9-to-5 thing these days, but it ebbs and flows. Like there are other times where I'm able to go into lab at 9, finish by 5, and then the rest of my time is, mine to do as I please. So in that situation, work-life balance is very harmonious. Other times it's kind of off kilter, but I think it's important to remember that, and to keep in place that like those times are temporary. When it comes to communicating with my advisor about professional or emotional support, I think like in the spirit of trying to keep my research more like a job, I might be kind of an outlier in this regard, but I try to see my PI more like my boss more than like a peer or like a friend. So I definitely turn to my advisor for professional goals and professional support, and she's great. She's been super supportive throughout my whole PhD, and she's honestly probably the most supportive PI I've ever seen in like my whole experience of working in different labs. But when it comes to like emotional or like personal support, I would probably I definitely turn to like my friends and my family instead of my PI. And I think it's just because like I need to compartmentalize those things, because if I like I think if I bring in like too much of like the personal and the emotional into lab, it gets really easy for me for like my own like identity to get wrapped up in that whole situation. So I try my best to like divide my lab life, my lab self, and like my personal self, if that makes sense. When it comes to like my support system outside of lab, I would say like your cohort is a huge source of support, because you guys are all going through the same thing together. You guys can commiserate. I would definitely also recommend making friends outside of your PhD program if possible. It's important to have people that you can talk about stuff besides science or besides research with. So my friends here in New York have been a huge resource, and then also like just being diligent about staying in touch with friends from North Carolina, which is where I used to live before I moved here, has been huge. outside of lab, I am big into running. Running is a great way to clear your mind when you have a lot of stuff going on up here, thanks to your research. And also is a great way to establish like work-life balance. Like if you are training for a race or something like that, you have to implement time into your schedule to train for the race. And that means you can't be spending all hours of the day doing research or being in lab. So that also helps a lot with making sure that I can balance all of that. Outside of running, I am trying to become a better cook. I think like also like cooking is a great way to kind of like separate my work self and like my life self. Like when I come home and am able to like actually like take that time to like cook something for myself, I think it's like a great transition period between whatever else is going on in lab and then whatever else like I want to do with the rest of my evening. And then when it comes to expectations, I think the big thing here is like being really upfront about your expectations and then making sure that your advisor also has an opportunity to be upfront about their expectations from the beginning. So I would say like from the like when you first meet them in the beginning of your graduate school career, like just asking them straight up, you know, like what are your expectations for graduate students, and then listening carefully to what they say. And then as you continue to work with your advisor, keeping in mind like what they said about their expectations and whether or not that their behavior aligns with what they said, right? And like sometimes those things, what they say and what they do might be very different things, and you might find that frustrating or incongruous. But I think another thing to keep in mind is to like communicate your expectations as well for a mentor, like how much mentorship you want or how much involvement you want. And you know, you and your advisor might be in different places when it comes to that, but seeing where you guys can compromise or meet in the middle. And then also learning to pick your battles about certain things. Like for example, my advisor is the kind of person who like, if I give her a manuscript to review, like she'll come back and like, it'll be like full of like all these very, very, very like minor corrections. And at first like about like wording or like phrasing and things like that. And at first it was like really frustrating for me personally, because I didn't want like that level of micromanagement. But I think like for me, it's been a lot of like realizing to like let certain things go, and then but then also to like advocate for myself when I do think that like certain things like should stay the way like that I wrote them originally, or like explaining my perspective on why I wrote a certain thing or why I phrased something a certain way. So I think a lot of it is like picking your battles, but also like standing up for yourself when you need to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. And then Ajua, how about you? How do you balance your work and life at Yale?
I would say, I think sort of similarly to what some of us were saying before, but depending on what is on your plate for a semester or for a year, this will sort of look different, because you just might be, there's some semesters where you're just overloaded. I'm thinking about, especially in our program here at Yale, during second and third year, everyone is required to teach, and some folks are still sort of finishing out their coursework. So some folks might be taking courses, teaching courses, and still trying to conduct research, meaning that they're going to be strapped for time, essentially, because there's a lot of responsibilities associated with all of those commitments. So I think something I try to do at the beginning of each semester, or not try to do, but I do this, is I make like a semester plan, which is, I mean, right, that can, it starts with like, what are the goals that I want to sort of hit in terms of my research, in terms of my writing, in terms of also things that are unrelated, so personal, so that I'm thinking about those things actively. I start with those goals, and then I sort of back plan with like, what do I need to be accomplishing by the end of each month, and then what do I need to be accomplishing by the end of each week. And right, and so I do that, and obviously these goals will shift and sort of be flexible depending on whether or not, for example, you know, you might run into a snag with your data, which will then push like the timeline for data collection back, right? But you sort of have that structure that's just helpful to you in sort of thinking about like where you are and what you're doing in the context of this like long road that is a PhD. I think something else that I do that I feel like is useful is tracking my time. I like to track my time and I sort of like organize it into different categories. So like, how much time am I spending doing service? How much time am I spending doing mentorship related things? How much time am I spending reading? How much time am I analyzing data? This is just useful for me to get a sense of like, one, what can I even expect myself to do in a given week, which I think is extremely useful for figuring out how to plan effectively. And then it's also useful to sort of get a sense of like what your boundaries might need to be. Like you might need, you might need more attention from your advisor depending on where you are at the course of a project, because you just might be at a point where you might need to shift the research focus, or like critically like redesign studies, or design the next set of studies differently, like those types of things. And that just might require more feedback from either your advisor, other professors, or peers who are closer to the project. I think in terms of my support system, I agree with a lot of the things that have been said. I obviously, my cohort and I would say we're much closer at the beginning of our time, just because you guys are all sort of taking similar required courses and having to teach. You become less connected as you go further along on your program, but I still talk to them, right? Like relatively frequently. And I also like work with them, like, because we all have the common goal of trying to write our dissertation right now and get our manuscripts out. So that's been a big support system. And then similarly to what Michelle said, I have a lot of friends outside of my program who I hang out with, but some of them also just are in programs. Like I have a friend who's studying for the bar right now, and I just have a bunch of work to do. So I was literally earlier today, we just had like a 2-hour study block. Even though we're doing totally unrelated things, it was nice because, right, I was not in my normal lab environment, which was, I think, stimulating. And you also get to see people that you don't otherwise see. I think in terms of interests, they shift. I used to be heavily involved. So I did a lot of, I trained in classical ballet growing up, and I did a lot of like dance related stuff in college and even into the PhD, but that has taken a back seat just as my research load has sort of taken off, and also with the pandemic. For me, I try to do a lot of body work because I find that it's really useful for regulating my mood. So whether that be doing cardio at the gym or doing Pilates or yoga, I think that's another way that I can, between like the workday and like my time at home, I'll often use like that type of body work to like mark the difference. So I often do it like right after I'm done with work. And I feel like it's quite relaxing for me, but you should find what is relaxing for you. Like knitting is also something I like to do. I like to listen to music, just, figuring out what you like and just kind of doing it, and finding like-minded people who have similar interests, I think is something that's worth investing time into. And then I'm just going to quickly try to, what can and should you do if you realize your expectations are incongruent? I think just to quickly answer this, I will just say your expectations will shift as well, because you'll be at a different point in your PhD and you'll have different skills, right? Like there will be things that you know how to do that you won't need feedback on, that you did maybe in your first or second or even third year of your PhD. So you'll notice that you'll become more independent, and you'll also notice that your advisor will probably give you less, there'll be less micromanaging depending on where you are. So I think, as Michelle said, asking what their expectations are and then taking note of where you are in terms of learning and other researchers you can count on, meaning like older grad students and postdocs in your lab, is a good way to like help you make sure that you're getting the support you need without sort of like always going to one person. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Ajua. And then Carlos, what about you? How do you balance work and life?
Yeah, so how I balance this, I found the system for myself where I actually kind of work backwards from figuring out expectations and deadlines of things. Having all of like the deadlines I have that can either be like months away, 2 weeks away, and putting them into like a priority list of like, okay, this is a top priority, but I have like 3 months, so it can be a little bit lower versus like the small thing, let's just do tomorrow, and then kind of just plan out my week and see like, okay, if it's going to be a lot of work of like in lab, or it's going to be a lot of writing, because I have found out that I've always known this about me. I hate writing. I will procrastinate and do everything before I do that. So when I have big things to write, like papers or my perspectives, I just blocked weeks off just to go write with some small data analysis in order to make myself available, just actually do that in real time. And but other than that, I really try to have a not 9 to 5, as Michelle said, but a very rigid schedule. Mine's like 10 to 4, and then I work in the evenings / late nights doing data analysis at home. Because in between, I do go to the gym and cook for myself to like get some clearing of my head, because I just completely put down my phone and anything electronic that anyone could connect to me and just do my own thing. The kind of support systems I have is, as everyone kind of already mentioned, is the cohort. They really are the closest people to having the same life experience as you are currently, because they're in the same program. They have the same institutional problems, because there's some things that will just be institution dependent, and like they just know what's going on with you, more in tune with you than like other people would. And there's just great for like just talking and complain, because they want to complain, you want to complain, you can do that over beer and just have a good time. Because everyone does it. Even like I think even the PIs will do that with their own selves. They'll have things. So it's a very common trope to do that in all of academia. And they also get support system, because when you have problems and you don't know if it's just a you problem or if it's like a institution problem, you can ask them like, hey, like my friends have asked me, like, my PI is not letting me do an internship. Is your PI like that? And then we all tell our own experience, like, oh, my PI is really open. And we tell them, oh, may talk to the grad student advisor, which controls all of the grad students, like problems. You can go to them confidently and tell them things, give them advice. Also, like if there's ever any problems with like stipends, my university this past summer, there was a big drop in admin where a lot of people miss paychecks. And because you are essentially getting paid the same as you cohort, you can talk to them and be like, hey, I didn't get my paycheck. Did you get your paycheck? And then you can all figure that out and then yell at the right people together to make things be fixed quickly. So they're great for both technical and administrative questions, also just for complaining. For interests I do outside of lab, personally, I try to find hobbies that are still kind of aligned with things I like to do. Like I'm doing a PhD because I like doing the things, but I try to find hobbies like building Lego sets and photography, because they're more artistic. There's no goals that I have to meet. This is there for me to express myself and take my mind off things, but yet feel accomplished when I finish them or do them. Because in a very STEM-oriented PhD, there's always like deadlines, there's always expectations, papers, is getting paper published or not. There's always like merits that you have to meet. But when you have free-form hobbies, they are whatever you want them to be, and it's a way to just freely express yourself.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carlos. And then Hannah, can you talk about how you balance work and life at Chicago?
Yeah, I think similar to Michelle, for me, it's been really important to try to keep my work life and my personal life very separate. So I also treat my research like a 9 to 5 when I can. Sometimes they do bleed into each other, but I really do try to keep those things in my life a little bit separate. And I think that it's not something I really did at the beginning of graduate school. It's something that I started doing during the pandemic in particular. And for me, at least, it's made my perceived quality of life a little bit easier, but you know, it's definitely like a personal thing. So for support systems, I also have a mix of people within the program that I feel like I can talk to. I think a lot of Carlos's points were really great in terms of like comparing what is and is not normal in terms of what your advisor is like letting you do or not letting you do, having these people that you can talk to, regardless of whether or not your research interests are really different, just in terms of like structurally and logistically, what do things look like for you, is something that's really useful. And I also do have friends outside of the program. Sometimes it's really nice to just kind of like not be talking about work all the time. And for me, that's been a really valuable aspect of my life in Chicago. I will say, having a good advisor, or like an advisor who, you know, takes you seriously and like considers your needs and is thoughtful towards you and your work schedule, is really important. My advisor in Chicago is awesome. He's been really awesome, and I think has been really responsive to the things that I have said that I prefer in terms of work schedule. I've had friends within my department who have had really bad luck in terms of meeting advisors and have really kind of struggled and suffered over it. So I think if there's, you know, kind of a thing that's really going to make or break your grad school experience, it's whether your advisor is respectful towards you. And it's, you know, very unfortunate, but a lot of different things in graduate school, whether it's your research or your schedule or what your day-to-day looks like, are highly dependent on your advisor in a lot of these ways. So for me, when I have a conflict with my advisor, I just kind of talk to him, and typically it gets resolved. But, you know, I've known many people who haven't really had that privilege and have really suffered as a result from it. And things that I do outside of the lab. I really like to draw. I really like painting. And recently I've started to play badminton, which I think has been really fun. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you, Hannah. I really appreciate all of that. And now we're going to move into, I think, our last big question for today. So what happens after a PhD? A lot of folks were interested in what sort of career options there are for people who complete a PhD, what your goals are, so whether you're interested in academia or industry, and how you see pursuing that. So Ajua, do you think you can answer this question first?
Sure.
Awesome.
Yeah, so how do I maintain my passion? That's a great question. I think the way that I would probably answer this is that I think going to talks in areas that are unrelated has been really helpful for me, just because not unrelated to your research question, but like not necessarily in your department is basically what I'm saying. I think that's been really useful to me, because I think hearing how other people are thinking about problems that you're thinking about helps me, one, gain some perspective on like what my role is as a researcher in like my field, like what are the contributions that I can make with this work to like just people's general knowledge about like a topic. What are ways that you can approach this topic that are very specific to your area. I think, right, I will say, like, your ability to figure out, to find these types of talks has a lot more to do with maybe like your research interests. I mean, because I study stuff that's at the intersection of all these different things, it's definitely easier for me to find talks. But I would say, like, you know, some of the sort of most like academically stimulating moments have been that I've experienced like over the course of this PhD program have come from me going to an unrelated talk that had something to do with something I was vaguely interested in, hearing this person talk about their work, and then thinking about a problem that I'd been sort of grappling with in a different way as a result of like how they were thinking about a topic. So that really helped, and it actually eventually like spawned this like new line of research that I'm doing that's unrelated to my primary like dissertation topic. And I think that's the point, right? Like, you obviously, you're so much more than like this thing that you've like decided to dedicate these years to, but you're also developing so many skills and talents that will that have greater impact than like this one sort of like vessel that you're putting your energy towards. And I also think having sort of different things going on gives you some, is giving you, it sort of forces you to give space to maybe what your primary research area is, or like the one set of studies that's like the next set in your like main body of work, which I think is really healthy. Like, I would say taking time away from my main project, doing something related to a side project, and then returning back to my main project, then also gives me some mental space, which is, I think, necessary for like doing good work. And then, okay, I'm gonna skip the lesson I took the longest to learn for right now because I have to think about that, but how do I deal with failure, burnout, and all of these things that are listed, which is such a huge question and topic. I think what I will say is I remember during my first year of graduate school, I did not have a good sense of boundaries between like work and personal life. And you have a lot of responsibilities, and it's like you're in this community of people that you think is like, you're dealing with the imposter syndrome of it all. And I would say like, I learned a lot during that year, like what my limits were, because I was pushing myself to my limits and like past them, you know, just like, I really had to become better at like planning and considering myself through scheduling too much, doing too much, not getting enough sleep, all of these things that led me to like feeling super burnt out at the end of my first year, needing a lot of sleep and needing to like figure out how can I make this sustainable for me, because it's very much a marathon and not a sprint. So thinking about like the longevity of that you need to like do this major thing, turn in this dissertation. I think you kind of learn by doing and sort of doing improperly. I would say, I feel like the strongest lessons that I've learned have been through like mistakes that I've made, essentially. Like I really had to sit down after that like really bad burnout period and figure out like, how do I need to organize my life so that I'm, you know, obviously progressing, but I'm not like doing so in a way that's unhealthy, you know? I think some of the aspects of the question that have to do with sort of interpersonal issues and biases, and maybe a touch of imposter syndrome, I think as you advance in your PhD, you will soon learn that within your sort of department and environment, you're the expert on your material. You're the expert of the study that you're creating. You're the expert of the data that you're collecting, right? Like you should build confidence because you know what you've spent the most time sort of putting your eyes on. I think, you know, after obviously you're working with experts in like the fields that you're interested in, but in terms of like who is spending the time on this specific project that you're working on, that's you. So you should like walk with that confidence. And then I think you start realizing that people are obviously extremely smart, but may not have the domain knowledge that you're building over the course of your PhD. So you get a better sense of like, okay, whose opinion is actually, do I need to really take into strong consideration, and who's just sort of being critical for the sake of being critical. So like learning to like who to listen to and to listen to yourself better is, I think, a big part of gaining confidence during the PhD. Because people will always have something to say, but it's like, you know what your research is designed to do and like the questions it's designed to answer. So some people's comments might actually not be relevant to the work that you're specifically doing. And so learning to temper that is a skill that you develop. In terms of career options, I'm interested in pursuing academia, so I'm committed to taking that track. So I do want to do a postdoc, and I do want to apply for jobs after that. But I will say, like, if you know that you don't want to do academia, there are a lot of opportunities. One, to do internships, or two, to just like apply your research expertise to a problem that's not as narrow. Academically, it's just, I think it's a lot in terms of getting those types of positions. It's a lot more about like who you know, I think, or who you're able to talk to. So if you know that you don't want to do academia, often at schools, there will be some sort of group that's organization that's set up that's dedicated to like helping PhD students transition out of academia and into industry. And that's definitely a resource that if you know you don't want to do academia, you should take advantage of. Because then you'll get access to training, but you'll also get access to opportunities. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you, Ajua. And Carlos, what about you? What happens after your PhD? What do you thinking about doing next?
Yeah, so I'll just go through the bullet points. The way I keep from passing for my research is learning how to take time off, and that involves literally. I found my way. Escaped my way to convince my PI to actually let me have 2 weeks off once a year, where he cannot contact me. I'm usually somewhere very foreign, like that. Last summer was Alaska, so there was no way I was gonna have any signal. And so it's just being able to find ways just to completely drop everything and just be like, I'm done, everything is as is, and just leave it as is and come back with fresh new eyes. And again, excited to keep working on this because you do miss doing the things. And I'll just skip the lesson because it kind of involves with imposter syndrome, but the ways to deal with failure and burnout I feel like burnout comes a lot with you trying to push yourself and feeling like you keep failing, but you have to realize that you're doing the newest kind of research, you're more likely to fail than anything. And like failure is just you proving something is not possible, because failure doesn't mean it's bad, it means it doesn't work. A lot of times when you're just experimenting, you could have a very clever idea and it just works off the first time, or you can just do the other way, which is you try 100 times and just find the one good solution and ride that off in the sunset. But there's a lot of failure. You just gotta accept that, well, I proved it doesn't work, okay, let's keep trying something else. And for imposter syndrome, for me, that was a hard problem because of the fact that I've always been afraid of sounding stupid in front of really, really smart people, especially when like group meetings, people would be spitting ideas about things, and I would have some, but I would just hold my idea back because I was afraid. And it took me long to realize there's this kind of spitballing ideas. It's like no bad ideas. It's a idea to discuss and keep thinking about it. And after hearing a lot from a postdoc, which I really admire in his technical expertise and his career path, that he was pretty much saying the same thing I was thinking like 10 minutes later, that my ideas are actually not bad. And that slowly allowed me to grow into me realizing I am eventually going to be the expert on the thing. I should be confident knowing that I will know everything else, especially when in my later years in the career that my PI keeps asking me for a refresh, like, oh wait, it was this, and he'd be like, no, I'm telling him like, no, it's actually this way and not that way. And that's just helped build confidence in knowing that I am the expert at the end of the day. And for me, career options, I'm actually going to do something in the middle, not academic, nor industry. I'm thinking of doing a national laboratory. So it's kind of still like the very research kind of level of things where like you still try and do kind of academic style things, but those national laboratories are usually funded directly by the government through mostly like defense contracts, where like they have cool projects, but they're always trying to either do it directly for defense or it's just for like NASA stuff. It's one of them. Space research is a lot of that, where you can just do research and be less worried about the whole academic cycle that it really is unique in itself.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carlos. And then Hannah, how about you? What are you thinking of doing with your PhD?
Since we're running out of time, I'll just focus on this last question. So what I'm going to do after. So I am actually planning on going into industry. So if anybody has any particular questions about what that looks like, I'm happy to, if you have my email, I'm also happy to like kind of talk about it with you. But yeah, it was for me, I think, a decision that I basically didn't make until maybe like 2 months ago or 3 months ago. And it's along, I think, with one of the lessons that took me the longest to learn personally, but it really took me a long time to kind of square the fact that like, I love research, it's amazing, but like, it's not my self-worth. And like, if, you know, when research goes well, I was always like, wow, it's so amazing, I'm so amazing. But when it went poorly, it was always kind of like, oh no, I'm not worth anything, or this sort of thing. So I think squaring, it goes along with separating my work and my personal life as well. But I think squaring these two parts of myself have been a particularly important part of graduate school, and in general, kind of like having the sort of very specific and passion-oriented type of work experience. But yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hannah. And then Michelle, what about you? I know that you're still a little bit earlier in your career, but what are you thinking about doing after your PhD?
Yeah, I mean, people keep telling me it's never too early to start thinking about what you want to do after your PhD. So yeah, I think right now is like a really exciting time for people in STEM PhDs to think about what they want to do after their PhD, especially when it comes to thinking about stuff outside of academia. Like people have mentioned industry. I think like, you know, with that like spans like biotech startups to like large pharmaceutical companies. People also get into like science writing and communication, science education, science outreach. People have started also going more into like consulting fields. I don't really know as much about that, but I've heard that's very lucrative. Or like policy and government, those are also positions that people can pursue after their STEM PhD. Personally, for me, I have decided that I would like to stay in academia if possible, but not to become a PI. I think I've realized one thing about myself is that I really enjoy supporting people in their research, but maybe like not necessarily with all the baggage that comes with like having to be a PI and like write grants and like run that whole enterprise. So I think right now I'm thinking about maybe becoming part of a core facility or working in like research support, whether it's like in grants and contracts, or yeah, maybe becoming like a staff scientist in like at NIH in some capacity. So those are just a couple of my ideas so far.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. And then as one last super quick lightning round, we're gonna have all the panelists answer like, what is the one piece of advice that you would give your pre-PhD student self? And Carlos, if you could kick us off, that would be great.
One pre-self would be keep read a lot of papers. It's something that I've always not found the most exciting thing, but like it's always good to expand your knowledge on everything and what's happening at the most newest things in the field.
Awesome. Great advice. Thank you. And then Hannah, what is one piece of advice that you'd give your pre-PhD student self?
I think, I don't know, more like life stuff. Like for me, it was probably finding my network and making sure that I had a community that was there to support me. I found it eventually, but I think it was something that I underestimated upon entering grad school.
Absolutely. And Michelle, what about you?
I would say that so in graduate school, you're expected to learn new skills. And like, of course, like that's the reason you go to graduate school is to learn new skills. But the thing about learning new skills is that you have to be bad at it first before you become good at it. So I would say like being okay with the fact that like being bad at something at first is not a bad thing. Like that's just part of the process. And like to not avoid doing that thing because you're bad at it, like the only way you're going to get better at it is to keep doing the thing. So in order for you to become good at something, you have to be bad at it first. Don't be discouraged about it. I think like early on in my grad school career, I spent a lot of time being down on myself because I felt like I was bad at so many things.
Absolutely. Great advice. And then Ajua, what about you? What's one piece of advice that you'd give your pre-PhD student self?
Yeah, I think I would say use all of the experiences that you have during your PhD as like opportunities to learn things about yourself and about others that will be useful in a lot more context than you think. I think, right, like PhD programs are so demanding, but they're also like rich opportunity spaces. And so just doing a lot of self-reflection and using your experiences as opportunities for self-reflection is super key for getting the most out of it.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. And thank you to our 4 fabulous panelists today for helping us get a little bit more insight on what it's really like to be a PhD student in all of these different programs at all of these different institutions. So huge thank you to you all. And I will hand off to Weiji to end this panel for today.
Yeah, I have little to add. Thank you all very much. This was great to hear. I couldn't have given better advice. Thank you all. It's amazing how much insight you all brought to the table. I hope that people here will also, first of all, good luck with the choices that the attendees have to make in their own careers. And I hope that you also check out future Growing Up in Science events, which will be posted on the website and on Twitter. Thank you all. And thank you, Sophie, very much for moderating.